Saturation is one of the dimensions of colors that's absent from most color wheels out there. If you look at these colors, they're all pushed to the maximum saturation, but in real life, colors very rarely look like this. Today we're going to see why saturation matters more than hue in realistic painting. Most painters are familiar with hue, red, yellow, blue, and most of the time when we talk about color, we only mean hue, which is only one aspect of the three dimensions of color. There is another one, which is value, the degree of lightness or darkness of a color, which is often presented with this black and white value scale, but it can be a value scale of any given hue. The third one is chroma, and this is the one that often gets kind of skipped in early training. Chroma refers to how intense or saturated a color is. Sometimes it's called saturation or hue purity. It's the degree of purity of a color compared to a neutral gray. If you use a photo editing software, you might be familiar with the notion of saturation, which is almost identical, even though it's not exactly the same. Simply put, saturation describes the intensity of the color of an object emitting its own color, like my computer screen right now, while chroma describes the intensity of the color of a real object compared to a neutral gray object placed under the same lighting conditions. So chroma is a pretty tricky notion to understand, but it's super important, and you need to pick the right paint tube based on how it can affect the chroma of your mixes. And the one thing you need to be careful about is the difference between chroma and tinting strength. A paint can have a high chroma but be very weak in mixes, meaning that it has a low tinting strength. On the other hand, a strong pigment like a phthalo might not look like much on the surface by itself, but prove to be very powerful when mixed, so it has a lot of potential to raise the chroma of other mixtures. It all comes down to experience and knowing your pigments. The use of a pigment with high tinting strength can have a very overwhelming effect in terms of chroma. Some colors dominate more than others, so make sure that you mix the various pigments in the right proportions. The biggest challenge, honestly, is to keep the colors vibrant, yet not overdo it. Of course, color is a complex subject, and I know that it can be intimidating to get into. If you need help figuring out the essentials, such as mixing, theory, harmony, you can check out my advanced color course. It comes with lots of great resources and detailed demonstrations explaining portrait, still life, and landscape. In realism, most of the normal subjects that you might need to paint never really contains those super high chroma colors. If you look at these samples, for example, we're far from reaching the highest potential chroma in this case. Same thing here with this bright red, which looks very powerful and strong, but we're far from the maximum chroma, which would be all the way here. The blue is pretty muted, as you can see. The green is actually closer to gray than it is to the pure green that the screen is capable of producing. The yellow is quite bright and almost there, but it's not fully there. So even things like artificial objects with bright colors appear much duller than we imagine. Our brain has a tendency to exaggerate the saturation of the things we recognize, but the paint usually needs to be more reserved. And the truth is that you can often be slightly off in terms of hue and still have a believable result as long as your value and chroma are right. But get the chroma wrong, especially if it's too high, and the color will just suffer on the canvas, no matter how correct the hue is. That's why many professional artists spend not a lot of time really obsessing about mixing the perfect hue or getting the perfect color match, And we actually spend a lot more time thinking in terms of color relationships. Is this color too bright, too vivid? Should I mute it or make it more chromatic? How does it compare to the colors around it? And this is why my strategy is often to prepare a generic mixing base, actually a small value string of a given color, and then I constantly adjust it to increase or decrease the chroma depending on what I need. And I'll go more in the specifics of how you can increase or decrease the chroma later, like technically how you do it. But you have to remember that for most colors, the chroma can remain relatively low. In portraits, for example, real skin is mostly low chroma. Even in the rosy cheeks or the red of the red lipstick, for example, you can still get away with such a small touch of red. And if the pigment has a high tinting strength, you can actually get just a super small dab with just the very tip of your brush, and it is still enough to revitalize the entire mix quite considerably. So, to control chroma, you need a way to mute colors intentionally. Here are a few tricks used in classical painting. The first thing you can do is you can use complementary mixing. Complementaries are color opposed in the color wheel, like for example this one with this one. When they are diametrically opposed, they are called complementary. And when you mix two colors that are complementary, as you can see, the line goes through this gray area in the middle, the gray point. So anything that goes along this line towards the center is going to decrease in chroma. For example, you can add a tiny amount of cyan, like this cobalt teal blue or a phthalo turquoise, to mute a red. Pigments diametrically opposed in the color wheels are complementary colors, as we said, but the effect of this kind of lowering of the chroma also works with pigments that are not technically the perfect complementaries. As long as they are somewhat on opposite sides of the wheel, it should somewhat work. So note that it's not necessarily to have a color that's exactly a complementary for the chroma drop to be effective. Another option to reduce the chroma of your mixes is to use a grisaille mixing scale. You can use a pre-mixed grayscale to soften a color without altering its hue too much. It's simply graying down a color simply by mixing it with gray. And the final idea is to start with a simple limited palette that leans naturally towards lower chroma. For example, instead of picking up a yellow, cadmium yellow, for example, pick yellow ochre, right? This is how you naturally reduce the colors of your paintings and you avoid oversaturating your mixing. This is the advantage of a limited palette. There's always been this idea in my mind that chroma is a little bit like sugar for the eye, and as with sugar, it's important not to overuse it. It's not what feeds you, it's not the core of the painting, it's just a nice touch that makes it taste good, but you want to reserve it for only the parts that are really worth it. Now let's talk about increasing the chroma next. And it's a different story as it relies more on the tinting strength of your pigments, the pigments that you start with. You can't exceed the potential of your paint tube. If you start with a weak pigment, you can't just magically make it more chromatic in the end. That's why most painters like to start with strong, vivid colors with high tinting strength on their palette, even though most of the time they are not going to push the colors to their limits. You just want to pick pigments with high potential just so that you can raise the chroma when necessary. It doesn't mean that you want to do that all the time. But when you do need it, it's great to have a pigment that can handle high chroma. Here, for example, I wanted to paint this woman with cherry red dyed hair. So, of course, I need all the chroma that I can get out of my mixes. I want to avoid overdoing it, but I also want to make it really pop. So I used my bright Pyrrole red, which is a really strong red pigment, to really push that vermilion core tone. And I added some quinacridone rose, also a very powerful pigment, to reach those cherry undertones, those more magenta undertones. With red, you always have to decide whether you want to make it lean more towards red-orange or red-rose. And here, what I want is red-rose. So I really want to get in these kinds of undertones, those magenta undertones. So here, I want to push my cutter to the highest potential chroma that I can achieve. But now the question is, how do I achieve to paint the shadows and highlights? It's important to understand how chroma is affected by the two other dimensions of color, value and hue. How do I achieve to paint the shadows and the highlights? Should the shadows also have the same high chroma than the local? Should the highlights have the same chroma? Here it's important to understand how chroma is affected by the two other dimensions of color, value and hue. So let's see how chroma is affected by the two other dimensions of color, and let's start with hue. As you can see, all the various hues don't have a chroma that peaks at the same place. Some peak more on the left like that, like this blue, some peak more on the right, some peak more in the middle. Red, yellow, green, blue, they all have different chroma behaviors. Each hue has a specific peak chroma value, a value at which it can reach the highest chroma. A red tends to be more chromatic for the average values. A yellow will generally have a peak value that's closer to the lights. So this is the lightest parts, this is the darkest. And with yellow, you generally go a lot more towards the right, so towards the lightest tones. And with the blue, on the other hand, it will reach the maximum chroma for rather dark values. This means that the most chromatic red that can be achieved will not have the same value as the most chromatic yellow that can be found. Understanding this phenomenon is crucial for an artist because it explains why it is impossible for an artist to create a dark yellow as bright as a light yellow, for example, or why a light blue doesn't have the same punch as a deep blue. And now let's see how chroma also depends on the value, and you can see it really well on a chart like that. Chroma is not evenly distributed on the value axis. It's not a flat line. If you start here, you can see that as it gets darker, it gets closer to a neutral gray. This means that the darker the color becomes, the less chromatic it becomes. But it doesn't mean that making the color lighter will always increase the chroma, because as you can see, once you reach the peak, if you start and if you continue lightening it, it will also decrease. So the more you go towards the lightest tones, the more the chromatic intensity decreases, the amplitude decreases as the value approaches white. So this is a super important notion, the peak chroma value. I call it home value sometimes. It's the highest chromatic potential of a given hue. The main thing to remember here is that chroma isn't absolute. It's always relative. A red might look dull next to an orange, but it might look vibrant next to a gray or next to a cyan or a green. That's why good chroma control also means controlling the relationships between colors on your canvas. Use dull colors to support the more saturated ones, and don't try to reach something harmonious by making everything vibrant and pop. That kills the effect. Instead, what you want is build contrast through restraint. If you want to watch another video on color theory, you can click here. I'll see you for the next one, my friends. And as always, joy and inspiration to you.